Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits wherever you are in the world. I would very much like, if I may, to continue with my exploration and journey through the works of John Carpenter, the one, the only John Carpenter. Today I'd like to focus my attention on the film from 1998. This is the film starring James Woods, and it's the film called Vampires. So this is the film from 1998, directed by John Carpenter and produced by Sandy King, with a script by Don Jacoby, which is based off of the original novel Vampires, with a $ for the S, by John Steakley, who is a very renowned author. I don't know if you know the book Armor, but anyway, the book is the underlying source material. Vampires is the underlying source material, but there are a number of differences between the underlying book and the film adaptation that we have here. This video is not designed to be any kind of comparative analysis between book and film, but it is focusing in on this film directed by John Carpenter. There are many concerns, many themes about this film that I think are very quintessential John Carpenter. He is working with certain cinema genre traditions that are very much John Carpenter. He is working, of course, with the horror genre, but that is not all. This is as much a Western film as it is a horror film, and I'll try to get into those details later in this video. But that is one way that this film is a connection to a kind of cinematic past, and we've seen John Carpenter do this. But it is also a very savage, brutal, over-the-top, zany, thrill ride that really just starts from the get-go and doesn't let up, and there are a number of twists and turns along the way that really keep one on one's edge, not necessarily knowing where this film goes. It's quite an interesting ride, I must say, and the way it's trying to weave in certain genre traditions on the one hand, and yet still trying to keep a kind of freshness and newness, and make some new developments, if you will, in these particular genres, I think is very interesting. And it's a testament to the fact that John Carpenter is a filmmaker that always is trying to push the boundaries, push the envelope, do something different, do something unique or unexpected with films that otherwise are susceptible to very understandable genre expectations. And so I think this is another example of that, and therefore it is a very essential and quintessential film in the late part of John Carpenter's career. This is the film Vampires. Now, before I get any further, let me just speak about the particular Blu-rays that I have here. First is this Shout Scream Factory release of the film Vampires, or John Carpenter's Vampires. And this is a really good Blu-ray. This is a Region A Blu-ray, but it's very nice. It has this new cover art, and it has the reversible sleeve. I've chosen to keep the new cover art here because I think it's very ornate and very evocative. It also comes with a slip cover, which I have over there, and the features are really quite exciting. We have a short little selection of interviews that are gathered together for a 12-minute little documentary of sorts. It's called Time to Kill Some Vampires. And we have interviews with John Carpenter, Sandy King Carpenter, as she's identified in the documentary, and Gary B. Kibbe, who is the director of photography, who has been Carpenter's director of photography for a number of films now during the later phase of Carpenter's career. And so this film has a certain look that is undeniably a John Carpenter look to it. These participants in this documentary, 12-minute short, talk about certain aspects of the film, how it was shot in Mexico for the most part in terms of its locations. They talk about James Woods and his portrayal as Jack Crow, and how the actor was a kind of force of nature on set, and that John Carpenter says he has a good working relationship with him. They also talk about Daniel Baldwin, and they make a really interesting reference to Daniel Baldwin as a kind of Robert Mitchum looking person, and I see that he has certain rugged features that I think really contrast well with James Woods' Jack Crow, and so I think that's a really a great bit of casting there. And also they talk about Cheryl Lee, who is a pivotal role in this film as Katrina. It's probably the most complicated character in the film, and it's a real very physical and quite challenging role for any actor to play. There are certain moments that I think are especially challenging, and I think Cheryl Lee does an absolutely amazing professional job. In many ways, her performance is one of, if not the highlight of the film. And it's really amazing to behold in many respects. I mean, there are certain aspects to her character and what her character experiences through the film and how she is treated by other characters in the film that I think is a certain issue, and I'll try to address that later in this video. But in terms of the performance itself, I think it's absolutely amazing. Cheryl Lee is really amazing in this. And we also have mentionings of other actors here like Tim Guinea and Thomas Ian Griffith, which we'll get to later. And also there's even mentions of the fact that this is indeed a Western film. There are Western influences and references being made. There's also reference to the Tommy Lee Wallace directed sequel, Vampires Los Muertos. And so it's interesting how there's a discussion about that. So a very worthwhile supplement to check out. So this is the Time to Kill Some Vampires. And then the next supplement we have is a 22-minute interview with James Woods called Jack the Vampire Slayer. And again, he is talking about working with John Carpenter. He's also talking about working with the other actors. He brings up an interesting point about how, generally speaking, the natural instinct of an actor in a Hollywood production would be to want to compete with his fellow actors, or his or her fellow actors on set. But James Woods wanted instead to adopt a different approach. And he decided to meet with Daniel Baldwin and say, let's not compete, let's cooperate. And so that's an interesting anecdote that he cites, and he therefore acknowledges that as being the reason why he had so much fun on the set. And so that's great. He makes other references to it, which I think are really fascinating. He talks about references to Weekend at Bernie's, which is interesting. He talks about references to Westerns. He talks about references to Clint Eastwood. He mentions Henry Ford. I think he means Henry Fonda in terms of references made to Westerns. And if that's the case, then I think, yes, his casting here in this film is very reminiscent of that kind of Western casting. In particular, there is a kind of Henry Fonda vibe that he gives off in this film, and so it's interesting to hear him mentioning that in this interview. And he also talks about certain possibilities that were considered all the way in sort of pre-production phases in terms of any other alternative endings that might have been planned, whether or not they were actually shot, that's not mentioned at all, but there were some scenarios, I won't go into detail, but there were some scenarios of possible different endings that might have been planned, and there are some photos that are actually shown of that, but nothing, of course the film ends the way it ends. So, but it's again a very interesting worthwhile interview to check out. This is with James Woods. And then there is another interview with another actor from the film. This is called The First Vampire. It's a reference to the character Valak in the film, who's played by Thomas Ian Griffith. And this is a 9-minute interview with Thomas Ian Griffith. And he's talking again about his experience with the film, his experience with John Carpenter, a very positive experience with John Carpenter. He's also talking about his interactions on set with James Woods, and he has praise for the actors on set. He has special praise as well for Cheryl Lee and the kind of physicality of her performance. He also talks about Jeffy Mata, and he also talks about his hair and how he had short hair, but how his hair had to be long for the character. And so he's talking about the extensions that were given to his short hair in order to make his hair look long for the film. And there's a little interesting story that he gives about going to a bar and some of the hair extensions fell out. And so that's an interesting story. So it's an example of why you should check out this great interview with Thomas Ian Griffith called The First Vampire. And then there is another interview with, it's called Raising the Stakes, and this is 10 minutes. It starts off with John Carpenter and then Sandy King Carpenter talking about Greg Nicotero, of course, of KMB fame, but he's very, very famous in the horror world, the special effects world. And then this continues on with a conversation with Greg Nicotero and about how this film involved a lot of special effects. There's a particular effect with respect to one particular character played by Mark Boone Jr., which is a very memorable moment in the film. He also references other past John Carpenter works like The Thing, and he also mentions Westerns and the like. So this is another great interview. Again, 10 minutes with primarily Greg Nicotero. And then there is another supplement which is called Padre. This is a 12-minute interview with the actor Tim Guinea, who plays Father Adam Guiteau in the film. And he talks a lot about working with John Carpenter, working with the other actors. He's also talking about Blade and also this film. There's a great anecdote about how he had plans to get married during the scheduled shooting of this film. So he has a really interesting anecdote about missing his plane and because of the shooting schedule, and a really lovely thing that John Carpenter and Sandy King did for him, which resulted in a very interesting, one-of-a-kind meeting with a pretty famous person, or a person with famous connections anyway, in a private jet. And so you should check out the interview for that particular anecdote. He also talks about a very interesting anecdote that he shared with respect to shooting a particular scene with James Woods. After rehearsal, they broke for lunch, and then they came back and they actually shot the scene. And in one of the takes, there was a very comic episode having to do with uncontrollable flatulence. And so I think I'll leave it at that, but it's a very amusing episode that he recalls. And so that's another example of why I think this particular interview with actor Tim Guinea is really worthwhile. So this is called Padre. And then, of course, it's a reference to his character in the film. Then we have an original making of featurette, and this is a documentary that was made contemporaneously, so in the late 90s, together with this film. And so it has that really interesting sounding narrator voice, and it also has various interviews edited together with John Carpenter and with James Woods, Thomas Ian Griffith with his great hair extensions, Cheryl Lee, and it's great to see Cheryl Lee in giving an interview, and she's still in sort of her makeup, which is a very interesting choice, and also Daniel Baldwin and Jeffy Mata, and also some behind-the-scenes footage. And then after that, we have what might be said to be sort of the raw components of this particular documentary. In other words, the documentary relied on interview footage, and so we get the longer extended interviews with certain members of the cast and crew that were then relied upon for this main documentary. So we get those component interviews with John Carpenter, James Woods, Daniel Baldwin, and Cheryl Lee. And then we get a behind-the-scenes B-roll, which is essentially video footage of behind-the-scenes, shooting some films, talking behind the scenes. We see some of this footage then relied upon for the main documentary, but it's nice to see a slightly extended portion of this. So this is the original making of featurette. And then we have the original theatrical trailer for, I think, the North American market, because it says for release in October 1998. And then we have, as another supplement, we have a collection of TV spots, which is interesting because you can tell that some of the TV spots were actually videotape recordings with that slightly rough quality, but I really enjoy that aspect of it because it reminds me of when I was a kid growing up, and in fact I saw some of these commercials play on TV, so it's nice to see them. But that's not all. Also in the TV spot section at the very end there is a Japanese trailer, because as some of you may know, this film not only had a Japanese release, but there's also a connection in terms of funding from Japanese entities, and so but it's interesting to see the Japanese trailer in the TV spot section, because there's a lot more violence shown and there's a lot more of the plot shown. And it's a very interesting thing to see how it was marketed. So, and then another supplement is a separate section for, it's called the stills gallery or the photo gallery. So you just press play and it just automatically goes through the various stills and production photos and promo materials, etc. The curious thing about this photo gallery section is that usually on other releases they'll have some music playing over the soundtrack, but here for some reason I checked, when I pressed it there wasn't any music playing. It was just the stills and there was no music. But other than that's a very minor thing. The important thing is, of course, being able to view the pictures. So that's an interesting feature as well. And then if we go to other features, we have the isolated score, which is available as an audio option. What's also available as an audio option is the audio commentary track with John Carpenter. And it's just John Carpenter himself, but this is it's always great to have an audio commentary track with John Carpenter for any of his films, because he just has so many great things to say. He is very humble, he is very modest. He is so earnest, and so he's very energetic, and he's also very honest and critical where he needs to be. And at the same time, he really gives a great assessment, great explanation as to what's going on with the film. He does talk about, for instance, certain aspects of the musical score. You know, he is credited as being the composer for this, which is a really great score, by the way. But he also talks about some of the very famous musicians that worked on the score, that performed on some of the musical tracks for him, like Steve Cropper, Donald Duck Dunn, or Jeff Baxter, or other people, and he also talks along the way about specific references to westerns or to horror films, and certain details like that. So this is, I think, a very essential commentary track to listen to. As with every other commentary track that he has done, they are all essential, including this one. So it's really wonderful to have. And so this is, in a nutshell, the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray, Region A Blu-ray release of this film, Vampires. Very, very recommended if you are a fan of John Carpenter. Let me just add very quickly that, as I say, there is this release as well, which is the sort of slightly earlier Powerhouse Indicator release. This particular release that I have is what's known as the limited dual format edition, and so this has a DVD and it has the Blu-ray, and this is region. It's all region or zone free, or region ABC for the Blu-ray, and so you should be able to play it without any issue. It's a very good one because it has an audio commentary track, the commentary track with Carpenter. It also has the isolated score option. It also has the original making of featurette that I mentioned with the main documentary, and then the source material separated interviews with John Carpenter and Daniel Baldwin and James Wood and Cheryl Lee, etc. So that's also its own special thing, but that's the same as the Scream Factory release. But it also has a great interview recorded in 1994, which is the Guardian interview with John Carpenter, Part 1, 1962 to 1983. The director discusses his career with Nigel Floyd at the National Film Theatre in London. And so it's him with Nigel Floyd on the stage, and they're in front of an audience, and he is asked questions about his career from early on in the 60s, and his short film career, and then through to his feature film career up to, as it says here, 1983. So this is part 1 of that. Part 2, if you're interested, will be found on a separate Powerhouse Indicator release of a John Carpenter film, which I will talk about in a future video. But for now, we're getting part 1. And while it doesn't necessarily fall directly into a discussion of this film, Vampires, it is still quite significant because it is talking about John Carpenter. And so from the viewpoint, John Carpenter speaks about John Carpenter. And so it's very good to have as a kind of start of maybe a survey, study, or understanding of John Carpenter's career, again, from his own viewpoint and experiences. So it's really worth having. Also, I should mention that this particular Powerhouse Indicator release is also good because it has this booklet, at least the limited special edition did. And if you can, it's really great because it has an essay by Kim Newman called John Carpenter's Vampires, which is a very good essay for many reasons, but I love how it makes specific references to past films that, again, provide further context into how this is, again, a quintessential John Carpenter film in the sense that it is working with past established cinema genre traditions. It also has an interview with John Carpenter, a printed interview, where he's talking about specific questions. Again, this is conducted by Jim Hemphill on October 2015 and originally appeared in Filmmaker magazine in the United States. There are some great questions asked. There are a particularly nice question about the score, and I like how there's a great moment where John Carpenter is talking about working with other composers on scores for past films. It's also fun for John Carpenter to work with other musicians like he did on the score for Vampires. And then he says here, I had a lot of fun when I got to work with other composers like Ennio Morricone on The Thing and Shirley Walker on Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And the interviewer says, that's one of my favorite scores of all time. And then John Carpenter says something really nice. He says, she did a great job. And she, referring to Shirley Walker, who also worked with him on the score for Escape from LA, by the way. But I think that's just a great example of how humble and how giving John Carpenter is, even in this interview. So that's really wonderful. I also like the little detail of how the print that's used is that a very iconic John Carpenter font. So I really appreciate that very much. So that's the booklet with the Powerhouse Indicator release right here. So it's recommended if you can get it, but this is also recommended here too, which is the Shout Scream Factory release, Region A release from a couple years ago for the film Vampires. Okay, so with that, I would like to continue my discussion of this film with some specific details. So, if you have not seen the film, please turn off this video, and if you are okay with watching sort of over-the-top stylized horror violence, that is directed by John Carpenter, then this film might be something that you could be interested in. If not, then don't worry about it. You don't have to watch this film if that's not your cup of tea. But if you are okay with that sort of film, this is certainly a film to watch, and I'd certainly be interested to hear what it is you have to think about it. So if you haven't seen the film yet, just stop this video, and then you can always come back at any time. This video will still be here, at which time it would be my pleasure to hear your thoughts about this film, John Carpenter's Vampires. So you're back, which means you don't mind me talking about specific aspects of the plot of this film, vampires, and other aspects that relate. I think that this is a very entertaining work. It's a work that comes, of course, in probably the later phase of John Carpenter's career up to now, the late 90s. And so he's made many films up to now, of course, many films. This film is a film that is dealing directly with a very respected aspect of the horror genre, a sub-genre of the horror genre, that is the vampire myth. And so it's nice to see John Carpenter tackle this particular myth in a very John Carpenter sort of way. But as he describes it in the commentary, he doesn't tackle it in terms of gothic tones or in terms of a classic hammer horror type of approach. As the James Woods character is saying to Father Adam, this is not what you see in the movies. This is something very different. And indeed, this is in part a vampire film, but it is also, in equal measure, a Western film. And so to think of this film as a horror Western, or to think of it as a Western horror, I think is probably the best way, for me anyway, to look at this film. And so that I think that's a good way to maybe begin a conversation of this, is that as we've seen in past John Carpenter works, John Carpenter is very comfortable working with past established cinema genre traditions. We've seen him working with past established cinema genre traditions in films like The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, even films like They Live, Prince of Darkness, Escape from New York, Assault on Precinct 13, Halloween, etc., The Fog, and on and on. But here we have a very direct reference made to the Western genre, and in particular filmmakers like Howard Hawks, filmmakers like Sam Peckinpah, filmmakers like John Ford, particular filmmakers like Sergio Leone, and others. For example, there are, I think, direct references made to Sergio Leone quite early on, around the opening sequence, where Jack Crow and his group are about to enter into what they suspect to be a nest of vampires at the beginning of the film. As they are making the preparations outside, we see Jack Crow standing, and he's just with his iconic sunglasses. He's just standing there. The camera zooms into his face, or he makes a close-up to his face, which is very, very reminiscent of a very famous close-up done on the face of Charles Bronson in the Sergio Leone directed film called Once Upon a Time in the West. There are other references made to Westerns. In general, Howard Hawks, for example, Red River, but Howard Hawks and his films oftentimes dealt with the relationships between men, the friendships between men, and how they are tested over the course of the film. And here we have one of the key relationships between two characters in the film. Montoya, played by Daniel Baldwin, of course, and then Jack Crow, played by James Woods. And we have their relationship and how it is forged over the time in the film, how it is tested over time in the film. We see the struggles, and especially when the Katrina character, the Cheryl Lee character, comes in to the fore, we see how her presence is affecting, of course, Montoya, to the point that he becomes, arguably, he becomes quite infatuated with her. And so it's maybe even attracted to her, but it's also, there's a connection between them because, as we know, he gets bitten, and so he is slowly turning into, his fate is slowly becoming the same as that of Katrina's, and so they are very linked in many ways. But in any event, I think how she figures into the equation is another way that we see the relationship between the James Woods character and the Daniel Baldwin character affected. And I think this is borrowed very much from Howard Hawks and other westerns like that, Red River especially. So this is another example of westerns being cited. And also there is an element of Sam Peckinpah. If we think of Sam Peckinpah as being a filmmaker that relies a lot on the stylized use of editing to create a certain effect, we see some interesting editing tricks that are, I would say, quite revolutionary in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. The editor, of course, is Edward Warshilka, and he is an editor that has worked on many John Carpenter films in the past. But his work here is quite effective. There's one particular scene where we have Valak coming into the motel and just causing all this carnage and mayhem and massacring the entire team and the female guests that are there as well. And so there is a certain way in which the frame is slowed down slightly with a little bit of slow motion effect. There are certain ways in which the editing of the violence is done in a way that is haphazard and lots of fades, but still creating a really chilling effect to connect this horror of the moment that's happening before us. So I think this is very similar to how we see Sam Peckinpah and the Wild Bunch, for example, using editing to slow down time to make punctuate points about the effects of violence in particular scenes of that film. And so there's a little bit of an echo with the Wild Bunch, in particular with the scene as John Carpenter shot it and edited by his editor. So that is another sort of Western reference, if you will, a reference to films of the past. And so I think this, therefore, is another example of John Carpenter at work in a John Carpenter way in a film directed by John Carpenter. This is a film, of course, that is not necessarily a John Carpenter scripted work. I mean, he was, in essence, a director for hire to direct a script that was already written, credited to Don Jacoby, based on the novel by John Stakely, of course. But there are certain imprints of John Carpenter's style and concern as a filmmaker that I think are here, one of which being his preference for the reliance and use of past cinematic genres. There are also, I think, links to past John Carpenter works which we have seen him do with other films, and his films always link to his other works as well as linking to other filmmakers, but they link also in the John Carpenter world in many aspects. We have a film that just really throws us, the viewers, into the plot very breathlessly, almost immediately, with a fast pace that is reminiscent. It reminds me a lot of how breathless and quick the pace of a film like Big Trouble in Little China was. It just really goes in and it never lets up. There are moments of downtime, if you will, to give exposition, to give plot points, etc. But it's more or less just throws us into the whole story and explains later along the way. And it leads to a very intricate showdown climax with a ceremony, which is very similar to the ceremony in Big Trouble in Little China. Here it's with respect to the Berzier cross and all that stuff about the cross being needed by Valak in order to empower him to be able to withstand sunlight and really cement his place in immortality, and also furthering the controversy with respect to the Catholic Church, or at least with respect to one particular cardinal, Cardinal Alba, played by the legendary Maximilian Schell. And so, there is this way of pacing of the film that is very reminiscent of past John Carpenter works, in particular Big Trouble in Little China, I think. There's also past connections through the characterizations, in particular the character of Jack Crow, played by James Woods. He is, of course, a character that came from the original source material. But he, as embodied by this particular actor, is really given a certain life and quality of a likable anti-hero. He has his flaws. He is very violent, and he's very rough with the people around him. And in particular, he's rough with Father Adam and also Montoya, but he's also rough with Katrina, which is a little bit of that could be a source of some criticism directed at the film with respect to how this film treats women, in particular the Cheryl Lee character Katrina, but I'll get to that in a moment. But the Jack Crow character is also a character that is his own man. He is his own sort of mercenary type. He is a crusader type. He is also a kind of conquistador type in terms of the sort of weaponry that he employs in order to hunt vampires as a slayer. And he dons his sunglasses and his black leather coat and his jeans, and so he has a kind of sort of an every person look about him, and yet he has a certain cool, and he has a certain level of intelligence and forthrightness that is very reminiscent of characters like Snake Plissken. In particular, Snake Plissken in Escape from L.A., the look is almost the same as that of Jack Crow here. And so Snake Plissken, I think, is a sort of soul brother, if you will, to Jack Crow, as played by James Woods in this film. And so I find that is a great connection to be made to John Carpenter films of the past. There is also a kind of interesting plot element in terms of the psychic link between Valak and the first vampire, and also Katrina, one of his victims. And there's a psychic link in that she can see what he sees sometimes, and so this leads to the further propulsion forward of the narrative, of course. But this reminds us also of certain aspects of John Carpenter's past. Perhaps it's reminiscent of one of the segments in Body Bags, which is called I, which is, of course, I understand it was directed by Tobe Hooper, but it is of course connected to the world of John Carpenter, in that it is part of the omnibus in which John Carpenter had a direct part in, of course. But this plot element is also reminiscent of maybe the film The Eyes of Laura Mars. And we are reminded of John Carpenter's contribution to a certain degree anyway with respect to that film. And so there is that plot element that recalls past John Carpenter works in that respect, I think. And also, there is this sense of a kind of larger, maybe conspiratorial aspect that hinges on a sense of paranoia. And we see this in the development of Valak and Cardinal Alba, and how power structures seem to be at play here. We assume that Cardinal Alba is probably acting on his own, of course, because he has that really villainous speech about how he doesn't trust his faith in the afterlife, and so he has to rely on the afterlife as bestowed upon him by vampires. And so there's a kind of sinister edge to that. But if we could see that, or if we were to interpret that as him representing maybe a larger force within the church, for instance, I'm not saying the film does that, but there is a hint of that kind of systematic corruption, if you will, that can lead to a sense of paranoia, and it's up to people like Father Adam or Jack Crow to essentially save the day, as it were. So I like that. That has a sort of link to other John Carpenter films of the past: Escape from New York, They Live, Escape from L.A., etc., etc. So there's a sort of discussion of power structures in this film. But this is, in essence, as I say, a John Carpenter film because it has certain John Carpenter stamps to it, even though it is not necessarily a story that was generated directly from the mind of John Carpenter. It is still undeniably a John Carpenter work for those reasons, I think. And there are a lot of very memorable things about the film. I must say in particular that the performance by the performance by Daniel Baldwin, I think, is very good. He is described in one of the documentaries for the Scream Factory release here as looking a little bit like Robert Mitchum in his later years, and he has that rugged, almost almost sad look to his face, which I think is so perfect for his character of Montoya, and it's a great contrast to the almost volcanic presence of James Woods as Jack Crow. So that very almost calm sense, almost serene, sad sense to Daniel Baldwin's performance, I think, is a really great contrast and counterpoint to the Jack Crow character. And his story with the Katrina character is another one of those emotional relationships that really forms a kind of anchor to the film, and it gives the film a little bit of further propulsion and emotional weight. It's arguably not the centerpiece of the film, mind you, but it is one important aspect, and it does explain certain things about the motivations behind the Daniel Baldwin character, and it also really highlights further the real emotional connection between Jack Crow and Montoya, especially at the end when Jack Crow realizes that his friend and partner will become a vampire, and he has no choice but to slay him if he were to find him again. But he gives him a little bit of a head start and as a kind of final act of loyalty, if you will, to his friend. And so I find that particular storyline quite poignant, and of course it led to that because of what eventually happened between Montoya and Katrina, and that particular storyline and how that developed. And still through all that, Montoya as a character still displays a sense of devotion, if you will, to Katrina, which I think is very it's very kind of almost honorable. It's an honorable aspect of his character, and I really appreciate that about Daniel Baldwin's performance. And then, speaking of which, the great Sheryl Lee is giving what is probably the most complex and challenging role in this entire film. Her role in this film is really, I would say, very difficult. There are some moments that are quite difficult. The physicality that's involved is very almost extreme, and she pulls it off magnificently. Her performance is magnificent. She does that great thing in terms of showing the effects of the psychic link and slowly turning into a vampire herself. And she really shows shuddering and shivering and screaming and really getting into it. But also there are the calmer, quiet moments, and where especially when she is alone with Daniel Baldwin, and the realizations that she has in that her fate in terms of after being bitten in a very sexualized way by Valak is going to turn her into a vampire. And so there are sort of quiet moments of quiet resignation that her character displays, which I think is really quite effective. And at this point, if I could just mention one of the criticisms I think that is aimed at this film, which is in particular how the women, and in particular the Katrina character, is treated by the male characters in this film, and in particular Jack Crow. Jack Crow, as I mentioned, is a very rough character. He tends to beat or hit, throw around a lot of the people around him. That's including Montoya, that's including Father Adam, and that is also including Katrina as well. And so for some people, it might be very uncomfortable to watch some of these scenes and to see Cheryl Lee being, or the character being treated like this. But I would just draw your attention to a couple of things, just in case, of course, with respect to this point. It's a very legitimate point to make, of course, but let's just keep in mind, at least according to the supplemental materials on the Shout Scream Factory release, there were attempts during the shooting of the sort of maybe the scene, the rough scenes with Cheryl Lee and her performance. There were attempts made, at least according to James Woods and John Carpenter, to make sure that she was taken care of, that it wasn't really her being hit or anything like that, or falling to the ground or anything like that. So they, at least according to John Carpenter and James Woods, they say that they tried to take care of her in terms of her acting. So it wasn't like the actor herself was injured or being hit or anything like that. So that's one thing. But if we were to talk about the universe of the film itself, and also talk about Jack Crow and how he treats her, one thing that James Woods and John Carpenter mention is that Jack Crow treats Katrina like this, but he also treats other characters like this. For example, Father Adam. And so in a weird sort of way, Jack Crow is almost being, how should I put it, he's almost being sort of equal treatment in terms of meting out his own sort of roughhousing violence in a way. And so it's not as though he is necessarily directing his energies and his rough temperament towards Katrina because Katrina is a woman necessarily, but the plot seems to suggest that he is treating her in a very rough manner because in his eyes she is going to become a vampire, and it's his sort of job in a way to essentially eliminate vampires as a slayer. So as a plot element, that could explain his treatment of her character in that way. And also we see him treat, in particular, Father Adam. He throws him out of the van at some point, and he just throws him down a hill and just hits him, and he falls over and stuff like that. So he's very rough with him as well. And so there's, as I say, there's a kind of equal treatment given to many characters, not just one character in particular. And so if that criticism of misogyny is still one that you hold, I think that's, again, that's a very legitimate one to have. I would just draw your attention to the fact that it is also possible, I think, to look at the film and look at the treatment of the Katrina character in the context of, as I say, the vampire slaying work ethic, for lack of a better phrase, as well as the character of Jack Crow himself and how he treats other people, not just Katrina. But again, food for thought only. And if you have criticisms of this film of that nature, again, I think those are still very, very valid. But amongst that, or notwithstanding that kind of potential criticism, I still think, and I think in particular, Cheryl Lee's performance is really bold and quite provocative and very, very memorable. It's one of, if not the most memorable part of the film for me, and her turn, she suddenly becomes villainous, and that moment when she's got the blood dripping down her chin and she's turned full vampire is really chilling and scary. And so it's really great to see that turn, and then all along the way, and she has this almost struggle, and there's a little bit of a spark or connection with the Daniel Baldwin character. But it's a great performance, and Cheryl Lee proves yet again the powerhouse talent that she really is. Absolutely fantastic. And I should also say that in John Carpenter's films, there are a lot of films that have great heroes, iconic heroes that that take center stage and that really are the people that we, the viewers, focus our attention on because they're so iconic, so charismatic, etc. But with some John Carpenter films, not all, but some John Carpenter films, while we get an iconic hero or anti-hero, we also get strong villains. We don't get villains in many of John Carpenter's films, but we do get them in a number of them. And so sometimes the villains are very iconic, and in fact, they sometimes need to be in order to create a strong story. We've seen strong villains like Michael Myers. We've seen strong villains like, let's say, even Christine. We've seen other strong villains of that nature. And sometimes the villain aspect can be more amorphous or more ambiguous. Look at films like The Thing, look at films like Prince of Darkness, or look at films like They Live. But then at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we have films that have a villain role or a bad guy role or the antagonist role. And that's Halloween, and also even Big Trouble in Little China with the Lo Pan character. Here we have one of, I think, a very, very strong villain in Valak, as portrayed by Thomas Ian Griffith. And he's not on screen for very long, but he feels like he is on screen because of his overpowering menace and the way in which he just kills everyone in that motel it's really quite shocking, and it just shows his power, and his presence, although he's not on screen, is still felt throughout the film. And so I think his stature as a villain in this film is really one of that of being one of the more stronger villains in a John Carpenter film. And I think that's really great because it really gives a nice sense of balance. We have such a volcanic presence that is the anti-hero of Jack Crow on the one hand, but then to balance that, or to counterbalance that, we have this overpowering, superhuman Valak on the other. And so he's just towering over him. He's huge. He's just his powers are limitless, potentially anyway. And so just to see the two of them face off is just one of those great spectacles. And again, a strong hero and a strong villain makes up for a great film. And this is another example of that. And that duel at the end, and it's not really necessarily that Jack Crow overpowers him with a show of force or strength, but he uses his brain in order to get the better of Valak in terms of knocking the support down, and the roof falls in, thus exposing Valak to the deadly sunlight. And I think he's using this to beat his opponent. But I still think that you have a strong anti-hero and you have a strong villain here, and that those two poles that are generated, I think, create a great film. And that's something that we have also seen in past John Carpenter films as well. And let me just end by saying that this is also a very memorable John Carpenter film in the sense of its use of effects. We have effects that are very graphic, very, very over the top, so bloody, and some of them very creative. Quite creative indeed. Some of the pyrotechnic effects and the fire and the use of the colorized orange flames, I think, is very effective. Those effects with the blood and the in particular that really gross effect of Valak essentially slicing in half the Mark Boone Jr. character. When you actually get that, all of a sudden, it's one of those, it just comes out of the blue. It's almost like one of those big surprises that you see in certain special effects shots in The Thing. I think as the years go by, and this film gains more and more in terms of critical stature. I think that particular shot of the Mark Boone Jr. character just basically falling in half will be one of those iconic moments, special effects gore moments in a John Carpenter film that might even be up there with other special effects moments that we've seen in The Thing or in The Mouth of Madness or things of that nature. So that's just really memorable and quite gross and very effective. But we see also other things, the makeup and the monster design is really quite frightening and eerie. The contact lenses and the eye coloring is very scary. The way that Valak flies about and he has his overbearing sort of posture really give chills. And so it's about the special effects and the makeup, but it's also about the way that the actors carry themselves and the like. And again, I'll bring in a mention of Cheryl Lee. She is also succumbing to the vampire sort of virus, if you will. And so her transformation is one of the central aspects of the film, and we see her transform before her very eyes. And so she suddenly becomes this monster, which is a really frightening transformation. And there's a particular moment where she actually bites into the neck of Daniel Baldwin. It's a pretty gross moment, and it's really extended. And so those really gross special effects moments, I think, last in terms of their overall lingering effect on the minds of the viewer. At least this particular viewer here, they're really quite gross and memorable. And so this is a film that's certainly not for everyone. And not all John Carpenter films are gross out horror films, but some of them are. And this film, in terms of its effects, I would say, is up there with other special effects films that we've seen from John Carpenter. Maybe certain films, maybe like Body Bags comes to mind, maybe In the Mouth of Madness comes to mind, but also films like The Thing comes to mind in terms of on-set practical effects. And actually, I would say that in terms of special effects and what's being achieved on screen, of course, the nature of the special effects here isn't the same as that of The Thing, I understand, but sort of the degree of the gore or the grossness, I would say, is certainly approaching the levels that we saw in the one and the only, the iconic film The Thing, which is to say that John Carpenter doesn't shy away from using special effects to achieve his means here, which is to ultimately tell an entertaining, thrilling, good, old-fashioned vampire western tale. And I think he does that quite successfully here in his oh-so-great John Carpenter way. So this is the film Vampires. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. What do you think of this film, Vampires? Do you like it? Do you not like it? In any event, my friends, please, if you want, you can let me know what you think by leaving a comment in the comment section below. And in the meantime, please continue to take very good care of yourselves. Please stay safe, be well, and my warmest regards to all of you, my dear friends, during these times. And so with that, until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much again for your time, and cheers.